Good afternoon, and welcome to our speaker series event. My name is Nisha Mohan, and I am the Principal Transformation Lead, Science and Technology, Transformation for ATCO, and I will be your moderator today. This lecture is the third lecture in the ATCO SpaceLab speaker series this year. The goal of this series is to provide ATCO's workforce and other listeners with information on promising developments in the relevant fields to outline where the state of the art is now and who are the leading experts in these fields and what is possible to achieve within a 10 to 15-year horizon. We previously heard from Dr. Hatton from the Oregon State University on August 18th. For interested attendees who missed the previous lectures, please visit ATCO's YouTube channel or ATCO internal Microsoft Streams. Our next lecture is going to be in December. Joining us will be Professor Elizabeth Bradley from University of Colorado, Boulder. Before we get underway with today's lecture, I would also like to remind you that the session is a one-way video and audio format. You can see and hear the presenters, but they can't hear you, which is not the greatest for audience feedback. So that's why we are encouraging you to ask questions. You can do so by using the question icon at the right of your screen. We will open up questions functionality roughly midway through Dr. She's lecture. You can address your questions to her. I would like to introduce Andrea Kleiberlangen, Vice President, Transformation, who has some welcoming remarks and will introduce our speaker. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, Nisha. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories and the original caretakers of the lands where we make our living and enjoy the abundance of the land with our friends and family. I am honored to live and work in Treaty 7, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Niitsitapi, comprised of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani Nations, the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary, Mohkinstsis, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, in all of the communities and regions where we operate. We are very pleased you have all joined us today for our ATCO SpaceLab speaker series. These sessions are a chance for us all to learn and share in knowledge and insight from thought leaders whose work and expertise truly inspire us. I have been fortunate to be a member of ATCO's transformation team for the last 3 years. We're a diverse and collaborative team of curious professionals with backgrounds that include law, engineering, business, physics, and other mathematical and material sciences and design thinking. So in addition to presenting the ATCO SpaceLab speaker series, ATCO's transformation team also leads ATCO's SpaceLab. SpaceLab is an enterprise-wide framework of support for the creative energy of our colleagues. SpaceLab provides funding and expertise for any ATCO employee wanting to test and to hopefully achieve sustainable new value for the company and for our customers. And we have supported the achievement of over 100 project teams since the fall of 2019. Back to our inspiration for today. We're joined by Dr. Yuntong She, who will tell us about ice in northern rivers. The ice in these rivers ranges in size from tiny particles to blocks the size of a house and can have a profound effect on both natural river ecology and human engineering projects. Dr. She will provide an overview on the different kinds of river ice, why they are important, and how a combination of field studies and computer simulations can be used to predict future river ice behavior. River ice modeling is particularly important for hydroelectric assets. Ice events can affect water levels, obstruct waterways, or cause damage to equipment, the effects of which could be mitigated with timely forecasting. Dr. She is an associate professor at the University of Alberta in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees from Tsinghua University before completing her PhD at the University of Alberta. She has nearly 20 years of experience modeling river ice, and as she's already told me, a great passion for river ice and its impacts, and is one of the developers of the University of Alberta's publicly available River 1D ice process model. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. She. Over to you.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Nisha, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. It's with great pleasure and honor to be here to talk about river ice processes. Well, all Canadian rivers and many other northern region rivers experience ice for some period of the year. And ice can affect natural processes. They can affect us in good ways or bad ways. So it is important for us to get some good understanding of the ice processes and also be able to forecast some of the key events. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge those who contributed ideas and the results to this presentation. Dr. Faye Hicks, she was my PhD supervisor, and she was also the person who instilled me the passion for river ice. Dr. Mark Lowen, he is an expert in experimental studies and also monitoring techniques, and we collaborate to monitor ice processes in the rivers. And also all the graduate students who studied and who are studying in the River Ice Research Group at the University of Alberta. And you will see their work throughout my presentation. And it's been almost 20 years since I first did a river ice project. I still often fascinated by how many forms river ice can present, and they're often weird behaviors. The ice in rivers can be very small, like a few millimeters or a fraction of millimeter, like those disc-shaped particles shown in this middle image. These are called fragile ice, and they form in turbulent water when the water temperature is supercooled to slightly below 0 degrees Celsius. These are the origin of pretty much any form of river ice. They are very adhesive in supercooled water, so they can easily attach onto things. Like in this image here, they attach to each other and forming a fragile block. It can grow in size through further attachment of fragile ice and also thermal growth of these already attached fragile particles. So as it increases in size, the buoyancy also increases, which eventually can overcome vertical mixing. So the fragile flocks rise to the river surface, and the exposed part freeze to form a solid crust of ice. And these are called fragile pans. They increase the surface ice concentration, and then they likely become arrested at locations of the river where the transport capacity is low. So when that happens, an ice cover is initiated, and then more ice pans coming in is going to lengthen the ice cover. So the ice cover will propagate in the upstream direction. So that's the general process of freeze up. I also have a picture here of river breakup. These are remnant ice on the riverbanks after an ice run had cleared out this section of the river. It has a very vertical inner face, so it's called a shear wall. The height of the shear wall is a good indicator of how high the water level or ice level had been at this section of the river. So in the event of an ice jam flooding, this would be important information or data to collect, because that tells us how high the flood level was. So talking about the ice jam flood, these are the greatest hazard river ice present to us. It can happen any time of the ice season when sections of the river breaks up. The broken ice is carried down the river by flow, and they can be arrested, again, at locations where the transport capacity is lower. For example, if we have bridge piers in the river, an island or tight river bend, or where the channel slope suddenly reduce, so the ice run can become arrested. And then the incoming ice run consolidate into a very thick accumulation, like was shown in this figure here. We can also imagine the bottom is very rough, so it is a big obstruction and also loss of additional resistance to flow. The water level has to rise in order for the flow to pass as compared to ice-free condition. So it's just like a small-scale dam, which store the water kinematic energy to potential energy through the ice jam and also for a distance upstream of it. So ice jam can let go, which is like a dam break, a small scale dam break. And when that happens, it sends a wave of water and ice downstream of the river. So I'm not sure if you can see this video right now. So this is an ice run from a released ice jam. You can see that is very destructive to structures in the river. So these ice blocks are hitting on the bridge piers. This is a very big one. You can see when it breaks, the thickness of it, and also it appears to still hold lots of strength, even though it is already the breakup season, the spring, and some melting may have already occurred. The other really interesting thing to note here is how high this water level in the ice is to the bridge deck. We know most of the bridges are often designed to withstand a 1 in 100 year open water flood. Now, this event, the flow may not be close to 1 in 100 year flood, but the water level is. So that again brings up the point that in the case of an ice dam flood, the water level can be much higher than an open water flood, even when the flow is similar. This is a very recent ice jam flood event that happened on the Hay River. It was just this past May. So this satellite image here shows the Hay River when it meets Great Slave Lake, where it split, forming a river delta. The delta is very prone to ice jam flooding. The communities, the town of Hay River and also the Katodishi First Nation face annual ice jam flood risk. The old town of Hay River used to be on the delta, but following a very severe ice jam flood event in the 1960s, the town was moved to higher ground above or upstream of the delta. But this past May, even the new town got flooded. So this satellite image that was taken on May 2nd shows the ice condition before the flooding event. So you can see the white is the ice cover, still pretty much intact with some melting happening. And then 10 days after, you can see these darker ice, those are rough ice. So that is an ice jam. And if I switch between these two satellite images, you can notice the difference in the water level between these 10 days. So extensive flooding and evacuation happened in this past event. Fragile ice, because of their adhesive nature, they can also cause lots of problems to infrastructures that withdraw water from the river, like hydropower stations, nuclear power plants, and also water treatment plant. The fragile ice and slush can clog the water intake and also the trash racks of power and the pumping stations, like shown in this figure. Currently, there is not really good way to predict this kind of events or to prevent this from happening. If the fragile condition is severe in the river, then there is really not any good way but to shut down the plant, to mechanically clear, or to thermally melt these fragile ice buildups, and neither is cost effective. This is another type of ice, anchor ice, forming on the bottom of the river. It could be the ice directly growing on the bottom of the river, could be the fragile particles got brought down by the turbulence to the bed material and attached there. And the weight of the bed material anchored the ice down to the bottom. So that's where the name anchor ice comes from. These anchor ice events are very dynamic. They are short-lived, often a single-day event or sometimes a multiple-day event. This video I'm going to show here is from Peace River, which is a quite big river and is with a gravel bed bottom. So here you can see a large piece of anchor ice mass on the river bottom. This video was taken from a bridge. And you can see the anchor ice is peeling off from the bed. And the released anchor ice float to the river surface. We can easily tell them apart from surface ice because of their appearance. They are so much darker as compared to surface ice. You can see some of these surface ice and big surface fractal pans. They are very white, while these released anchor ice are much darker because of the embedded sediment. You probably can even see those rocks embedded in the anchor ice. So here the entire piece of anchor ice mass is gone. And if we look further upstream, that part of the river is covered extensively by anchor ice. And this is a piece of a released anchor ice raft. You can see lots of sediment embedded in there, smaller rocks, and even large rocks, boulders, or cobbles are not unusual. So by this mechanism, anchor ice formation and release can contribute significant amount of sediment to the annual sediment load of a northern river. It can also cause morphological change of the riverbed. Anchor ice also has huge implication to fish habitat. This figure here, you can see the fish eggs, fish babies living in the substrate, and there are also those invertebrate living in the substrate in the gap of the gravels. When anchor ice form, they block the oxygen supply, the nutrient supply to whoever living in the substrate, and when anchor ice release, it basically lifts and move the entire bed like a bulldozer. So a river section that's affected by anchor ice is often depopulated each winter. So those are some of the problems, engineering problems or ecological problems caused by river ice. But there are also beneficial aspects of river ice. Ice jam flooding is often important for maintaining wetland habitat and ecosystem in some regions. The example I'm showing here is the Peace Athabasca Delta, which is one of the world's largest freshwater delta, and also one of the main features distinguishing the Wood Buffalo National Park as a World Heritage Site. And for lots of the perched lakes in this delta, they rely on ice jam flood to recharge them, because ice jams can bring the water level to a much higher elevation as compared to those open water flood can do. Ice roads, ice bridges are often used by northern communities for transportation in winter and also for construction. And for some remote communities, it may be the only means for winter transportation. And in open water seasons, they rely on ferries. So using ice road to transport some of the large goods like construction materials is much more economic as compared to transporting them by air freight. While observing and studying or trying to forecast these dynamic ice events can be very challenging because the complex ways that river ice interact with the river flow, the morphology of the river, and also the meteorological conditions. So there is a big need for us to improve our understanding and also our forecasting ability of many of the dynamic river ice processes and events. Climate change makes this need even more urgent because ice is very sensitive to climatic factors. We have already noticed the changes in river ice regime. I'm just showing one example here, which shows the timing of breakup of rivers across Canada. Those red points are where we have detected an earlier breakup trend, and the black dots are where a later breakup has been detected. The size of the dots indicates the significance of this trend that's detected. So you can see there are a large spatial variability of the trend, and also the climate change is probably going to make such variability even more pronounced. But overall, we'll say in general, there is an earlier breakup trend, there is a later freeze-up trend. So overall, shorter ice duration and thinner ice. So we might intuitively think that there is going to be less ice and there's going to be less problem caused by ice, which may or may not be the case, especially when we are talking about ice jam flooding. It's really hard to say how the timing, frequency, and the severity of ice jam flood are going to change, just because the very complex interconnectivity of all these temporal and spatial variables that's controlling and influencing the occurrence of ice jamming processes. Computer models, they can be very powerful forecasting tools. And if they're used with good laboratory and field data, they can provide very important insights for us to better understand these complex processes. There are a number of river ice models. Here I'm only showing our model, which is the U of A's public domain river 1D model. So it is simulating the river in one-dimensional, which captures the variation along the river, and it can simulate a wide range of river ice processes. And you will see some application of this model in my presentation. We also conduct field work to observe the river ice processes as they happen. This image here was taken by our grad student after they waded the river and deploy instruments for freeze-up monitoring. These waders are all frozen up, and you can see this ice, and the waders were standing on their own. So just to give some idea of the winter fieldwork condition in icy rivers, but we still strive to collect field data, and we need to be really creative to come up with ways to deploy these instruments in the river to increase our chance of getting good quality data and also be able to retrieve our instrument. This is a diagram showing the river freeze-up process. So I want to just use this diagram to explain our current knowledge state. So the part shown in yellow, that's the river cooling and supercooling. We have a good understanding of this process, and we can predict or model the water temperatures quite deterministically. And as the water temperature drops to below zero, so supercooled, and fragile ice form in the entire water column, they flocculate. Some rise to the surface of the water, forming fragile pans. Some ice grow on the bottom of the bed. Some got brought down to the bed to form anchor ice. We currently don't have a good understanding of the fragile rise and the flocculation process. And we also don't have a good understanding of the anchor ice formation and release mechanism. And as the concentration of surface ice increase, they become more likely to be lodged and stopped to initiate an ice cover, which we also are not having a very good understanding for. So as a result, all of these processes are handled in very empirical manner in all river ice models. So to address some of these knowledge gaps, we conduct a yearly field monitoring program in the North Saskatchewan River in the Edmonton Ridge. We put up cameras on higher locations like trees or bridges or a very steep bank to monitor the surface ice conditions. We have these cameras at key locations along the river, and sometimes we will be able to see the lodgement of the surface ice. We also install a weather station close by the river to measure a number of weather parameters. So this would allow us to better quantify the heat fluxes to and from the river. This one here is a net radiometer, which measures incoming and outgoing shortwave and long-wave radiation. So shortwave is the solar radiation. So both all of these are a critical component of the heat fluxes that control the thermal processes of ice. We also put lots of instruments in the river. This one is a steel case housing a high precision temperature logger and a depth logger. It is deployed at the bottom of the river, and you can see these big holes on the four corners. We hammer rebars into them, so to make sure the platform is fixed on the bed. The high precision temperature logger has an accuracy of plus minus 0.002 degrees Celsius. So that allows us to capture even very slight degree of supercooling, which is important for most of the ice process to start. This platform at the bottom is a bigger one. And same way, it's deployed at the bottom of the river. In addition to the temperature and the depth logger, it also carries two acoustic devices. The current meter is used to monitor the velocity field, and ice profiling sonar, it sends acoustic pulses upward and measure the signals that's reflected by the targets in the water column. And it can relate the signal to the size and the numbers of the targets. So in that way, we can monitor the fragile ice concentration that's suspended in the water, and also the thickness of the fragile pans that's passing by the platform. These cables are for power and for data transmission. This figure here is showing a deep water deployment. So the platform was carried by the boat, and the divers helped us to deploy the platform in deep water of a few meters. You can see these cables are the weak link of this whole platform. So we run them through this strong metal pipe and run that back to the bank so we can access the data and we can power the instruments. We also put lots of weights on the platform. We have a strong metal cable to tether to a good tree on the bank. So all of these efforts we put in are to increase the chance this platform is going to survive a significant ice movement event. This is an underwater imaging system that's designed to capture or to image fragile ice and fragile particles and fragile flocks. In particular, it's called a FragileCam. Took lots of trial and error to come up with this design. To the right is a high-resolution digital SLR camera that's in a waterproof housing. This is our light source, also in waterproof housing, a board to diffuse the light, and two polarizers, which are rotated 90 degrees with regard to each other. This basically creates a very dark background in the image, and only the ice that's passing through the gap between the polarizers will appear on the image, and they appear bright and also very colorful. The color depends on the orientation of the fragile particles. Between the polarizer and the lens of the camera, there is this PVC enclosure. So that is to prevent the fragile ice and also debris in the river to pass through the field of view, which could degrade the quality of the image. So this platform or this system is deployed on the bed of the river in wadable water. This is when it's taken out, you can see ice just quickly attach to it and quickly grow onto pretty much anything of this system. So we have our customized IV to insert or to inject hot water to melt any ice maybe forming on the polarizers or on the lens, or any fragile ice that may have got into the enclosure during submergence. just to keep everything ice-free so we can have good quality of images. The platform is left on the riverbed for about 2 to 3 hours per deployment. It takes image on average 1 per second. So at the end of each deployment, we got about 8,000 to 9,000 images. And this is just one example of the raw image. It is a large fragile flock. And by processing these images, we can get the statistical characters of the fragile ice and fragile flocks. And shown here are the time series of the number, size, and concentration of fragile flocks during one deployment. And by comparing them to the environmental variable, what is shown here is the water temperature, where you can see it is super cooled for during the entire time of the deployment. So by doing this, our goal is to better understand the fragile flocculation process and be able to develop more sophisticated algorithms to improve our current river ice models. This is a very similar underwater imaging system, but specifically to image anchor ice. The main difference is this artificial substrate. The rocks are collected from the river and glued onto the board. So it is representative of the condition of the riverbed. And also when anchor ice form on here, it is within the focus of the camera. It's deployed the same way as the fragile cam. The difference is that this is deployed and left in the river for much longer time in order to capture those multi-day anchor ice events. This video here was made by those images taken by the anchor ice camera. So I'm going to play it here. You can see quite clearly the ice crystals growing on the bed and the fragile particles attaching to it grows by thermal growth of the attached particles and also the in situ growed ice crystals. We can measure the thickness of the anchor ice. We can calculate its growth rate. And we can observe how it releases. In this specific event, it just was gone quite suddenly, but there are also other mechanisms of anchor ice release. So with more data like this, and also by simultaneously measure the environmental conditions, we can better understand the anchor ice formation and release mechanisms. We can assess the current algorithm in the river ice models, and if necessary, we can further improve those algorithms. And then we are hoping to improve our capability to forecast this kind of events. This one is a modeling study. It was done for the Susina River. There was a hydropower dam that was proposed to be built on the river, so it was of importance to assess how this hydropower operation may change the ice regime on this river. So a model is really suitable for evaluating this kind of what-if scenarios, not just the human activities, but also climate change. How is that going to affect the river ice regime? This particular project, the dam did not go ahead, so we were only able to assess the current state of the river ice regime, but we were able to have lots of data collected during 2 years of freeze-up, and those allowed us to validate our model, our river ice model. So what I'm showing here are just a few example parameters. The black dots or black circles are the observed values, and the red is modeled results. So here you can see we compared water temperature during cooling and freeze-up period. We compared the surface ice concentration for the entire domain of the river. We compared how the ice front progressed in the upstream direction. And this is the water level during freeze-up. In particular, notice this stage up. The water level rises for about 1.5 meters. This is when the ice cover was approaching the gauge station. And because of the additional resistance, the water level rises. So you can see the model also did a pretty good job to capture that water level rise. So this data was actually the most comprehensive data metric that was available to date to evaluate a river ice model. We need more data like this, and we need additional data of the simultaneously happening all the ice processes in the river. And that would allow us eventually be able to evaluate quantitatively all the components of a river ice model. And moving on to breakup. Well, breakup is a very critical event of northern rivers because the river undergoes significant or the most dramatic change during the year. And it has great economic and ecological impact. This one is a modeling study we did for the Mackenzie Delta for the 2008 breakup. The satellite image here shows ice conditions. The blue color is open water, green yellowish color is smooth ice, so ice cover, and these orange color are rough ice. So that is an ice jam. So we have a pre-jam condition and an ice jam condition shown in these satellite images here. And this is just a zoom in to where the ice jam had formed. And we simulated both scenarios in River 1D. So here is a comparison of the flow in the individual delta channels, zoomed into where the ice jam had formed. So you can see between the pre-jam condition and the ice jam condition, the flow in the individual delta channel had changed. And in this small channel here, the flow even reversed the direction. So we can see ice does affect the distribution of flow in the delta channels. And because Mackenzie Delta is one of the largest Arctic delta, any redistribution in the delta channels will affect the fresh water, the sediment, the nutrients that's going into the Arctic Ocean, which in turn will affect the sea ice formation. So to be able to reliably predict the flow distribution under various ice conditions would be very important to operational forecasting of, for example, the waves, the sea ice for marine forecasting. And ice jam flood forecasting really rely on models. So we need advanced warning on the expected ice jam flood severity. So at a long lead time, like 1 to 3 weeks ahead of time, we probably only be able to get qualitative information, like is the expected flood to be a low degree or moderate or high degree, and that is often adequate for preparedness planning purpose. This kind of forecasting is often done by data-driven model or empirical conceptual model. We have regression and threshold models that's on one or multiple key variables in the ice jamming process. Or more recently, the advanced soft computing, machine learning method has been widely used in this kind of forecasting. And then at moderate lead time and short lead time for event forecasting and evacuation forecasting, respectively, we need quantitative information of the extent, the timing, and depths of the flood anticipated. And these are achieved by deterministic models as compared to the data-driven models. So I'll talk about these physics-based ice jam release and ice jam formation models in my next few slides. Quite often, the ice jam formation and the release process in a river progress downstream in a domino fashion. So it's often the ice run released from an upstream, smaller size ice jam instigate the release of a downstream ice jam. And the ice run just grow in size as it progresses downstream. And when it stops and reform an ice jam and maybe close to a community, the flood risk is higher because the water level is going to be higher. So this animation I did for the Athabasca River 2002 breakup, where an ice jam release was captured by water level sensors that was installed along the river. And this ice run reformed an ice jam near the city of Fort McMurray. And at that time, it was still town of Fort McMurray. So we simulated this in an ice jam release model. This was the original ice jam. There were some surveyed data for the surface of the ice, so we compared our model to that, and it's a good match. We simulated the water level changes along the river. So again, the red is the model and the black is the gauge data. It may not look like the model is doing a good job here, reproducing the event, but that discrepancy is also partly due to the error in the observed data. I'll just use this one as an example, the G135, where you can see there is a sharp drop in water level at this point. And that was because the water level sensor was moved by the ice run to a much higher location. So it is a pressure sensor and is measuring the water depths above the sensor. So that is why this hydrograph looks funny. So that explains the discrepancy. So by integrating a river ice jam release model like this with event detection techniques, like satellite, like these water level sensors along the river, and also like remote cameras. Then if we see an ice jam form upstream, we can set up a model like this and say, if it releases, when is that flood wave going to arrive the community? And when it arrives, how high the water level is going to be, how much ice is going to be there. So this will be helpful for providing a moderate lead time forecasting. And then for short lead time forecasting, we really need to know the flood level. So that is achieved by ice jam profile modeling or ice jam formation modeling. Shown here is an example for the Hay River Delta 2009 breakup. There were flooding along the East Channel for the communities and lots of evacuation as well. So the U of A River Ice Research Team was there to survey the surface of the ice jam during several days when the ice jam was changing and consolidating in the delta. So here is the comparison between the modeled and the observed. This is the East Channel, which is here, and you can see the shades are indicating the location of these islands. This is to the West Channel and along the Fishing Village Channel. So you can see in both that the modeled and the surveyed surface ice elevation agree very well with each other. We rarely have any data for the bottom of the ice dam. It's just too dangerous to measure. So with a model like this and the information it provides, this can be closely integrated with communities' emergency operation system to facilitate efficient execution of an evacuation plan. We can also use the water levels produced by the model in a GIS system, a geographical information system, to produce flood inundation maps. Now, those maps would be very helpful to the communities to visualize the potential flooding scenarios, identify areas and resources that will be at risk, and also enhance their local response effort during a flooding event. Now the question comes to when and where an ice jam may form. You might notice that when I talk about those deterministic models, I talk about what if an ice jam release, then we can model these waves, the flood wave, when it's going to arrive and how high it is, or if an ice jam form here, how high the water level is going to be. But I did not talk about the prediction of when and where an ice jam may form, because it is actually a very complex question or a problem to study. It really depends on lots of factors: the pre-breakup ice conditions in the channel, the geomorphological factors in the receiving channel downstream of an ice jam, the flow conditions, not just the during breakup, even go back to freeze up. What is the flow condition when the ice cover just formed? The weather conditions, and more complicated is the ice cover condition in the receiving channel. I can show this video here, which shows the front between the moving ice and also the intact stationary ice. This is called a shelving front. So if you look closer to the front, you can see the movement there. It's very complicated. The ice, the moving ice, sometimes ride up onto the intact ice. Sometimes they dive under, and lots of pushing and the shoving happening. You can see these ridges at the shelving front. And this front can sometimes progress in the river at high speed for like kilometers or even 10 kilometers, very long distance. And sometimes they stop. The moving ice is stopped by the intact ice and forming an ice jam. This is in fact actually one of the primary mechanisms for ice jam formation. But we have very limited understanding for it because we rarely have good data documenting such events that's happening in the field. We have very limited, limited modeling capability. It's all conceptual models and or empirical models. So this is actually the main limitation of our current forecasting ability of ice jam flooding. And just some final remarks. Ice is important. I don't need to repeat on that. And we still have some gaps in our knowledge for some of these dynamic events. And in order to improve our understanding and forecasting ability, we need more data, both from the rivers and also in the laboratories. In the laboratories, we can study these complex events in a more controlled way, which is less challenging than the field conditions, but we still also need those field observations because those are the real processes. And this will help us to improve our model capability. The algorithms in there need further assessment. It needs to be assessed in the context of the model for all concurrent processes. And some algorithms are still empirical, so we need to improve them. And it needs close collaboration with the researchers and also the local communities and the private and the public sectors. So that's all of my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor She, for the great presentation. Now we'll be diving into our Q&A session. And a reminder to all of the attendees to use the question icon to ask questions. It's a moderated format, so once questions are published, you can see them and upvote the question if you would like. I will do my best to select a broad range of questions. Our first question is, have you studied saltwater ice as well as freshwater ice? If so, how do they differ?
Thank you. That's a great question. Me personally, I have not studied sea ice. My colleague, Dr. Mark Lowen, did, and also I have had some conversation with another colleague in Faculty of Science who is a sea ice person. So in my limited understanding, the main difference is obviously the salt content. And in sea ice, there are always, because of the concentration of salt, there is always those brine pocket, which is pocket of water that because of the concentration of salt is so high, it never freezes. So that is less likely in river ice, in freshwater ice. But there are many similarities between sea ice and freshwater ice. They are largely controlled by the thermal processes, so the heat fluxes are similar. But there are also those more dynamic processes, which may be more different in the rivers and in the ocean because of the wave conditions, the wave forcing there. There is also fossil ice in the ocean. Yeah, so I think, because I don't have a good understanding of the sea ice as I have for the freshwater ice, so I'm probably not going to do a huge comparison between them.
Thanks for the answer.
Thank you.
We have another question from Roger She. Is there a way to predict what minerals or pollutants or gases are present in a river by studying the ice buildup or creation?
Thank you for the question. That is also a very good question. So actually, water quantity and also the physics aspect of river ice is much more studied as compared to the water quality aspect, which is obviously also very important to study. And from the water quality side, we have better understanding and more study on the open water or ice-free season, but the ice-covered season or the ice-affected season are much less explored. We're actually just starting a new project in collaboration with Alberta government, with ATCO, and also with the North Saskatchewan River Alliance, and also the Athabasca River Council to look at winter water quality. So at the moment, existing water quality studies for the winter mostly focus on, for example, ice covered period when the ice is more stable, and the effect of ice is often taken as some kind of approximation, like it is a cover that blocks some of the solar radiation. So definitely we will need more work to do on the water quality side. So I may not be able to answer that question directly in terms of what minerals in there that we will see from ice study. But we did this project for stormwater pond in Edmonton, for which we were drilling the augering holes in the ice cover to take ice core samples and look at them in the lab. And in some cases we did look at some cases we looked at some of the ponds had higher salt content in there because of the snow melt. So yeah, that's something we have noticed. But yeah, definitely an important topic to explore more. And it is just the starting.
Definitely. Thanks for that answer. The next question we have is, how much warning can we get of ice jam floods? Like how soon can we predict it and so on, I guess.
So we try to get as much time as possible. So I can maybe explain this using a conceptual model. So it is actually the basis of many of the earlier threshold or regression models, and also it's a good basis of understanding the ice jam process. So say if freeze up, the ice cover is frozen up at a certain level, certain water level, and it will take the water level at breakup to go above that in order to lift the ice cover and break it. And it also, because ice jam is from ice run, so we need ice movement. So it can only, when the ice cover lift above the water level at freeze up, and if it can clear up the channel platform, that's when we can get an ice run. And then it's possible to get an ice jam flooding, which obviously you can see the deficiency in this system because we have an ice run, or even if we have an ice jam, not necessarily we will get an ice jam flooding. But that is the conceptual model to explain this. So now let's think about what will contribute to the rise of the water level in the river before breakup, which is primarily the snowmelt. So say if we have a very low snowpack in the basin, then we would be expecting the ice is probably just going to melt in place because there is not going to be enough discharge in the river to lift the ice cover. So there is not going to be much movement, and then we have a less chance of getting ice jam. And then if there is a moderate snowpack or a high snowpack, are we going to for sure get ice jam flooding? Which is, again, not a solid answer to that because it depends on the weather condition. Say, let's just use the high snowpack as an example. So we do have lots of snow that can contribute to discharge to the river, but if the spring is moderate, the temperature is cooler for a longer period of time, the snow may just melt slowly, and that water is going to slowly get into the rivers. So that, in that case, maybe the ice cover is not going to be dynamically break up and forming an ice run and subsequently an ice jam. But if it warm up quickly, then we will get lots of water in the river, and then higher possibility to get an ice jam flooding. So the reason I give this is tied to how much lead time we can get. So a long lead time, few weeks, is only qualitative information, and the accuracy may or may not be that good, because you can see it just rely on how the weather is going to proceed, right? In addition to all those ice conditions prior to breakup, we still depends on the weather forecast. And now we can forecast maybe 7 days, 14 days with good reliability, but we can maybe forecast the air temperature. But solar radiation is also an important factor that controlling these melting process. So yeah, that's my answer. We might be able to get a few weeks ahead of warning, but the accuracy may not be that good. And it all depending on the weather forecast as well.
I see. So there's actually exactly the question I think you answered, but I just want to anyway mention that. So that there's another question. It goes, thanks, Dr. She. Are the ice models for predicting ice jams or floods due to that heavily dependent on the weather predictions, just like any water floods? So how accurate are the models in general?
So yeah, that's a good question, because ice jam flooding does depend a lot on weather conditions, and it depends on other things as well. Like we said, the ice conditions prior to breakup, right? But the ice jam models, they can be used in different ways. There are models where it depends on the weather input, where we can predict how much ice in the river prior to breakup and what is the water level they freeze up at. But for the ice jam formation and the release models, they are more for the dynamic process. So basically, we have two type of breakups. One is thermal breakup, one is dynamic breakup or mechanical breakup. And it is the mechanical breakup that are often associated with ice jams and can cause flooding. And it is just a balance between the thermal factors and also the hydrological conditions in the river that which type of breakup will dominate, will happen. So the models is basically to look at the potential flooding scenarios. So if a mechanical breakup is going to happen, if an ice jam is going to form, how high the flood level we expect. And then the whole flood forecasting system would also depend on the thermal conditions. So we'll look at them closely, monitoring how the weather conditions is going to develop and predict whether it's more going to be a thermal breakup or a dynamic breakup.
I see. Thanks for that answer. We do have a lot of questions coming in, and we're prioritizing based on the upvotes they get. So just reminding everyone to upvote their most favorite questions. So the next question we have is from Ryan Maltese. So thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. One, I see you've done some predicting of spring thaw or ice flow. Earlier, no trend, and later. Have you looked at freeze up or creation of ice at the beginning of winter? I think we'll first answer the first question, then I'll move to the second one.
Okay, good question. So I personally did not look at the freeze-up timing myself, but there are lots of literature on that. For us, in this case, we only look at the breakup mainly because we were looking for a uniform long-time data series that would allow us to look at this trend historically. And for that purpose, we were able to construct a series for the breakup from the Water Survey Canada's flow data. And Water Survey Canada, they publish flow data online, and they put a symbol B to their discharge data because to indicate that is when the discharge is affected by backwater, and backwater is caused by ice. So we use those symbols to come up with timing of the breakup, which we found is relatively consistent. And by comparing to like field observations, these are more consistent for the breakup timing, but not so much for the freeze-up timing. It can actually vary by days or even weeks for the freeze-up timing. So that's why we did not look at the freeze-up timing for this one. But there are also other ways to look at the trend. But that's the answer that I did not look at it personally. But there is, in general, a later freeze-up and earlier breakup trend that's noticed in northern rivers. There is a large spatial variability. I will still emphasize that.
I see. Thanks for that. The second question is, have you looked at creation of ice on other surfaces, like windshields, highway surfaces, buildings, above ground infrastructure, and so on? So outside of the river or water flow?
Not very much. The only one I did was actually for solar panels. And I was collaborating with my colleague in building science to look at when snow form or snow falls onto a solar panel, what are the ways to melt it or to remove it. And by conducting a thermal calculation, or more like a modeling of the snow layer and also the ice forming at the interface between the snow and the solar panel.
Definitely of interest for ATCO.
Yeah.
Thanks. So the next question we have is your work in the Mackenzie Delta relevant for operations? Example, exploration in the area.
Yes, that specific study was more relevant to the marine forecasting, just because of we can predict how much fresh water getting into the Arctic Ocean, and that also what is the content in that fresh water is going to affect the content that's flowing into the Arctic Ocean, which affects sea ice formation. So we can also look at more closely, because that one is only looking at the flow rate distribution due to ice, but we can also predict the ice conditions in the delta, which will be more relevant to, for example, flood forecasting, emergency preparedness. Thank you for the question.
Thanks. The next question we have is, are there any artificial measures that break down any dangerous formations that the models would foresee?
Yes, that's a really good question. So talk about the ice jams specifically. There is actually icebreaker. So breaking ice is one of the measures to mitigate the ice jam flooding. It may or may not be applicable to larger rivers, but it's more effective for smaller rivers. I know the Red River has used it. It's called an icebreaker. It's like a big machine, and it has a large claw. So it can move both in the water and in the ice. So it just go into the river before breakup, and it used the claw to pull itself up to the edge of the ice and use its own weight to break the ice. So in that way, we break some ice, which the open water has a much smaller albedo as compared to ice. So it allows more solar energy to get into the water, warm the water, and melt the ice. So if the ice is weaker, the ice jam flooding will be less severe, just because the accumulation of the ice is going to be thinner with the weaker ice. So that's one of the ways for mitigation. Yeah, for prediction, so that is actually because I was also thinking the anchor ice clearing, but that is more like after the fact. It's already happening. You have to shut down the plant. For example, if it's a nuclear power plant, emergency shutdown can be quite costly. So that's not as effective as the breaking the ice cover to reduce the severity of an ice jam. But again, for larger rivers, it's not that effective. There are so much ice, and also when you break the ice, there needs to be a place for the ice to go. We don't want the broken ice to, again, congest somewhere else. There is, just to remember, the other thing is for mitigating ice jam flooding is to have a ice control structure. Sometimes like piers in the river, or like a dike, or sometimes it's like a boom. So it's a more flexible structure on the surface of the river, but it's anchored to the bottom, which can instigate, all of these can instigate the ice jam formation. But at a place like more desirable is to prevent or to protect the communities downstream, just by moving the ice jam.
Interesting. Thanks for that. Thanks for your patience answering all the questions. We still have a few more to go. So out of the types of ice you have showed us, which are the most stable ones?
Okay, thank you for the question. So the stable ones are the ice cover, the winter ice cover. So before that and after that, the freeze up and break up are very dynamic. So the ice cover, ice cover is the most stable, and also when it's safer for us to work on the ice. And also for Water Survey Canada, they publish the discharge data, and in the winter, they actually go out to the ice cover a few times. They drill holes, like lots of holes on the ice cover to measure the discharge in the river in order to correct their discharge data. So that is definitely the most stable time of the ice. But again, river ice has a high variability in thickness and strength. So definitely I would just say don't ever go onto river ice without proper training and the PPE.
Thanks for the answers. That's all the questions we have. So that actually concludes our session today. So thank you so very much, Dr. She, for her remarks and answers. And thank you to all of the ATCO colleagues who have helped put this event together. To all of you who joined, we very much appreciate your interest and invite to watch our social media feeds for information about future speaker series sessions. A reminder that our next session will be in December with a presentation from Professor Elizabeth Bradley from University of Colorado, Boulder. In the meantime, please stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha. And thanks everyone for your attention and the great questions. I enjoyed the discussion.